10 years ago, something came to Earth. I was a 17-year-old boy when I first saw it. Not a lime green Martian with a bulbous head and spaghetti limbs. Not an extraterrestrial angel plummeting from the stars in some advanced capsule. No, it was far more subtle than that. Far more sickeningly subtle. After all, if the aliens' arrival had been such a bold and captivating spectacle, you would already have known it was here. But you didn't. And 10 years later, I'm starting to fear that it might not be the only one. The tropes of science fiction often ring true. Perhaps those myths were born from true encounters with foreign races. I'm not the skeptic I used to be. As a cynical teen, I believed in nothing. No one. I lacked a code, had questionable morals, possessed only a bucket of testosterone in which sense and reason drowned. A flaw that nearly ended me. On that terrible night, I heard ringing. Like someone rubbing the rim of a glass to make it sing, and it seemingly stirred only me from my sleep. After leaning over to eye the alarm clock, I groaned. 4 a.m. I had to be up for college in a few hours. That grouchy temperament clouded my judgment, made me dismiss the risen hairs on my flesh, made me dismiss the instinct to run or hide. I should have returned to sleep, but I was furious about being woken from my slumber. I thought my little brother, Timmy, might have been to blame, or that perhaps Dad had decided to fetch himself a late-night beverage. It wouldn't have been the first time. Whatever the case, I craved conflict, and my hunger would soon be satiated, leaving a bug in my gut. I hopped out of bed. I was brimming with a hormonal flame that, no matter how hard I tried, could not be doused. It had to run its course. After creeping to the door, I opened it and peered out. I was trying to be quiet. If the noise had been caused by Timmy, I wouldn't have wanted to be caught by our parents. I was on the cusp of adulthood, but they still held the power to reprimand me for being out of bed at such an unsocial hour. Dad had confiscated my car keys on more than one occasion. Just a few months until I'm out of this hellhole, I thought, gently closing the bedroom door behind me. A displaced presence haunted my home. Stiff, heavy air weighed upon me, and I felt sluggish, slow. Only Millie, our husky, was awake, and she was behaving strangely. She did not bark, did not make much of a fuss at all. Yet, she was not asleep. Millie stood on the landing and eyed the darkness at the foot of the staircase. Eyed nothing at all. Still, nobody else seemed to have been woken by the eerie, piercing noise that had lasted for mere seconds. "What's up, girl?" I whispered as I knelt to stroke Millie. She looked up at me for a brief second, and I realised she was barely breathing. Then the dazed dog returned her gaze to the downstairs lobby of our darkened home. I followed her gaze, eyeballing the blackness a second time, and my gut filled with dread. Filled with something, at least. A living thing lurked in the lightless lobby. Something that my eyes didn't understand. Something that didn't exist in a way primitive eyes could understand. Come on, I told Millie, heading downstairs. But the dog didn't follow, and I didn't blame her. Even my feet seemed to disagree with me as I descended into the unlit dungeon. Every urge told me to hide until morning, but those ever-present teenage hormones raged onwards, propelled me downstairs in search of the thing that had disturbed my precious sleep. I tried to convince myself that it had to be Timmy, tried to quiet the unsettling thoughts in my mind, thoughts, it would transpire, that were entirely rational. When I reached the lobby, I turned on the light. It sprang to life, but scarcely illuminated the house. And the air was even heavier downstairs. It hurt to breathe, hurt to see. A darkness, like a black fog, filled the air, so dense that it obscured bulbs, rendering them practically useless. Still, I proceeded to flick switch after switch, hoping that slivers of light would ease the ache in my chest. They didn't. The kitchen was the darkest room. Even with every light glaring, it remained a dim cave of numerous blackened crevices, and entering the room felt like wading through water. With every step I took, the black mist resisted. I no longer knew whether the pain in my body stemmed from immense fright or the immense pressure of the fog. Then something rattled. I shot my head to the side, leaving my neck with a sharp pain from straining against such dense, oppressive mist. The rattling immediately stopped, but I saw something for a second. A terrible second. The kettle jiggled in its dock before halting, and I was overcome by a direful feeling, the possibility that the kettle had halted upon being seen. "You're tired, John," I thought, berating myself. "Go to bed." Tearing through the fog that had engulfed my fearful, fragile body, I turned to leave the kitchen, and that was when I noticed something bizarre. Something which took me a few seconds to fully digest. In the corner of the room, curled up in her bed, Millie was sleeping. Tasting terror-laced beads of sweat on my upper lip, I mentally retraced my steps. I had seen what I believed to be the dog on the landing. It hadn't followed me downstairs. I hadn't heard it come down the stairs. And I certainly would have seen or heard Millie if she had slipped past me to enter the kitchen. Then I noticed something else my sleep-deprived brain had overlooked. A hole in the window. A circular puncture, unnaturally circular, and unnaturally neat. Only a few spidery cracks spiralled out of it. Otherwise, the glass pane was untouched. Through the window, I saw a black trail leading into the sky, marking a fallen object's trajectory from space to my garden. Such a vividly black thread that it somehow stood distinctly against the night. And on the kitchen counter, beneath the hole in the glass, there lay a small rock. An indistinctive pebble. A pebble that was almost ordinary. Any sane person would have viewed it as a projectile launched by one of the neighbour's kids. However, a sane person is one who has been spared the horror of seeing what I saw in that kitchen. The rock emitted a substance that billowed into the air. The black mist. I felt an immediate urge to dispose of the maddeningly circular thing, but my survival instincts kept me away from it. Touching the pebble would have been the death of me. I knew that. My thoughts instead returned to Millie, the teleporting dog. and an awful idea slipped into my brain. Not teleportation, I thought. Duplication. I found myself backing into the main lobby, taking measured, hesitant steps out of the kitchen. And when I reached the bottom of the stairs, I was petrified to find, much as I'd expected, that Millie remained on the upper landing. She was shaking. Silently, but visibly shaking. I'd expected to look upon the beast with mistrust, but my eyes and heart told me that this was the family dog. A poor girl behaving bizarrely, but our poor girl nonetheless. There was no doubt about it, and that begged the horrifying question: what was in her bed? I didn't want to go back into the kitchen. However, if I'd returned to my room, I never would have seen the light of day again. I felt that in my core. Something was there with us, and it sought to do awful things on that night. So, against my will, I turned to face the kitchen doorway, turned just as a shadow scurried out of sight. The black mist was thickening, and my muscles howled from the exertion required to re-enter the kitchen. Upon stepping into the room, I looked at Millie's bed and my chest tightened. It was empty. Then came the sound of singing glass once more. Only this time, its melody was threatening. A battle cry. A warning to let it be and never look upon it again. I inspected the kitchen with frightened eyes, but everything was in the right place. However, I remembered the rattling kettle, remembered the cloned Millie, and a sickness stewed within my body. What else is this thing duplicating? The thought had barely formed before I realised something terrible. Everything was in the right place, but one thing did not look right. The oval handles on the kitchen cabinets were misshapen. Only after squinting for a few seconds did I realise that they were moving, swirling and shifting on the wooden doors, and each handle bore a black pinprick. They were eyes. As the thing realised I had detected its true nature, the cabinets returned to normal, releasing a black substance into the fog. I shouldn't have done it, but I screamed. In response to my shrill cry, the air began to ripple, as if quaking in fear. Fear of being seen before fulfilling its will, whatever horror it had planned for my family. Footsteps sounded overhead. I'd woken someone, and the black fog began to shrink, gathering into a condensed substance. The blackness was extracted from the air by the tiny pebble on the kitchen counter. The horrible rock, which hurt my eyes, swallowed the mist, and I exhaled deeply, realising that the air had become light once more. My limbs felt stronger. There was no weight upon me. "John?" my dad called as he reached the bottom of the stairs. "Why are you awake?" I watched the pebble fire off the counter at an unholy speed before exiting smoothly through the perfect hole it had formed in the kitchen window. "John!" my dad repeated, coming into the kitchen. "What on earth is happening in here? Are you okay?" My brave teenage facade crumbled, and I turned to embrace my dad with tears forming in my eyes. I forgot all about the trivialities of teenagehood. My resentment, my supposed adult mentality. My father was baffled by the embrace, but he accepted it, and Millie sprinted downstairs to join us, realizing that the haunting being had finally fled our home. Over the past decade, I hardly believed my story. As I aged, I told myself that I had sleepwalked, told myself it had been a nightmare. That seemed the most rational explanation, and it was one that I favoured, until last weekend. Now, I know that it was always real. I worked as a data analyst at an inner city firm. My office sat on the 11th floor of a skyscraper in a sea of bland towers. Still, the city itself is a bright, bustling setting. I often found myself daydreaming, staring out of my window at the traffic below. And when I worked weekends, I would peep into the office across the road, searching for other workers. Anything to make me feel a little less alone. On this particular night, around 10 in the evening, my eyes wandered to the glass monolith opposite my building. A few floors were lit, including the one in my direct eye line, but the office was oddly empty. Only one lonesome worker sat at a desk. My kindred spirit, I thought, chuckling. It's not exactly the most riveting form of people watching, though on one occasion I did witness a fiery conversation between two suited workers. One yelled and knocked a monitor off a desk. That was, perhaps, the only exhilarating thing I'd ever witnessed in that office. I was seeking that rush again. So, I eagerly eyeballed the late-night employee. Surveying somebody else working hard felt almost the same as actually working myself. Anyway, I prayed that something exciting would happen, but I wish that it had remained a dull night. For I realised something when I snapped out of my daydream. The man was looking at me. My cheeks flushed when I realised I must have been absent-mindedly staring at him for a long time. I decided to bite the bullet and accept the embarrassment of being caught. I uncomfortably raised my hand to offer a meagre wave. To my surprise, the man waved back, and that immediately settled the gurgling sensation in my stomach. I smiled, believing that he must be just like me. Another poor soul trapped in the endless grind of a corporate machine, deeply entrenched in the nightmare of working beyond Friday, beyond the 9 to 5. After snapping out of yet another daydream, I realised something slightly disquieting. The man wouldn't avert his gaze. Every time I looked away, I still felt his eyes upon me. And whenever I sneaked a peek, I saw that he was, in fact, watching me. Unmoving, unblinking. I told myself it might be punishment for peeping at him, but that didn't solve the twist in my chest. Though the office worker must have been 100 feet away, at least, I found myself slowly distinguishing his features. The brown wavy hair looked familiar, as did the stiff suit. Typical attire for corporate professionals, but something about the man's appearance was uncanny. And when I adjusted my glasses on the bridge of my nose, I understood what was unnerving me. The worker looked exactly like me. My mouth gaped, and I leapt up to get a better look, to prove to myself that I'd simply spent too many late nights at the office. As I pressed against the window and narrowed my eyes, I confirmed what I already knew. I was eyeing my doppelganger. Perhaps I would have doubted that if I weren't already unsettled by the eerie way in which he was gazing at me. I was thankful when somebody else entered his office. I hoped that would restore normality. Hoped it would reveal that I'd just lost my head for a second. Sleep deprivation has disoriented me, I told myself. Warped my vision. The second worker approached the first, and I waited for the new employee to distract my watcher, to free me of his unwavering gaze. However, when the second man stopped walking, I became aware of a terrible truth. He looks just like the first. Looks just like me. Hyperventilating, I twisted around and ran towards the lift. Ran whilst taking frequent looks at the office on the opposite side of the road. But the scene only worsened as more workers spilled into the building. Workers all wearing my exact face and clothes. They lined up at the floor-to-ceiling glass panes of their office, and every single head followed me as I sprinted towards the lift. I opened my mouth to yell. They mimicked me. Dozens of clones, standing and watching with mouths open. The alien creature had returned. Much like that fateful night in my teenage years, however, the foreign substance rejected my eyes. It did not like to be noticed. And black mist spilled from my many mouths, filling the entire floor until all light had been clouded. Until all workers had been clouded. Darkness lay beyond the office windows. After hammering the button several times, the lift finally arrived, and I hurtled into the metal box. It was the longest descent of my life. When the doors opened onto the ground floor, I immediately fled the building. A deranged man running through the streets, catching concerned looks from passing people. I didn't dare to look at the building on the opposite side of the street. Didn't want to see that black mist. Didn't want to see a lack of mist. Whichever would have been worse. And I didn't return to that job. I quit. Packed up my things. Moved far away. However, I keep thinking that I've only done the same thing I did as a child. I ran far from home then, too. Hoped to put the entire event out of my head. Yet, 10 years later, the unknown horror found me again. More than one. Now my eyes are open, I'm convinced that I see odd things everywhere. Both animate and inanimate things, moving in strange ways. I might see the same person 2 or 3 times in a public place. Might even notice my own loved ones acting strangely. And shadows no longer look like shadows. All has become the black mist.